Okay, so you're entitled to due process when the government tries to take away your life, liberty, or property. You're entitled to fair procedures when either the federal government under the Fifth Amendment or a state or a subdivision of a state under the 14th Amendment tries to take away your life, liberty, or property. I'm not going to spend time talking about what it means to take away your life, because that's pretty obvious. The question is, right, property and liberty, what is included in that? But sometimes it's easy, right? When the government takes away your house, your car, right, something that belongs to you, when it takes away your freedom, that's property, obviously, right? Money counts as property, right? Financial interests, property. Courts have even found that a public education, right, to which you're entitled under law, provides somebody with a property interest, right? That's why when a public school tries to dismiss a student, they have to offer certain due process rights. So those are clear property interests. Liberty, that can be pretty simple in some cases, right? Freedom to move about, right? So if you're restricted to your home, or restricted to a certain place, right, or not allowed to leave the state, or even easier to analyze than that, if you're in prison or jail. And by the way, when you're a lawyer, you'll find out there's a difference between prison and jail, a big difference. Those obviously involve liberty. Now, I want you to watch out for two fact patterns. Again, as we prepare for the end of the term and start thinking about exam and bar exam at a very practical level, right, we got to bottom line this. And usually in a procedural due process type of a case or problem, right, there's not going to be an issue with whether there's a liberty or property interest at stake, right? It's going to be pretty obvious from the fact pattern. Somebody has been arrested or detained, somebody has had something seized, right? Those are easy cases, and they don't present a problem, right, with whether a person is entitled to due process. Obviously, if the government takes your stuff, or obviously if the government detains you, you're entitled to due process, right? So here are the two fact patterns to watch out for. Number one is termination of public employment, right? Under what circumstances do you have a property interest in public employment, and under what circumstances do you not have a property interest in public employment? Okay, the second fact pattern that you want to look out for is harm to reputation, right? When that's all that there is, that harm to reputation standing alone. Is your reputation a property interest, right? So the government does something to ruin your reputation, right? Is that a liberty or property interest that entitles you to due process before the government ruins your reputation? Very interesting question. Does everybody get that? Think about that for a minute. You say, okay, when am I being tested? These are red flags, right? When am I being tested on the right, liberty and property interests? Again, this is the threshold question. If the government has taken away my life or liberty, liberty, or property, I'm entitled to due process, right? So we can test any step of the analysis. At that step, was there a liberty or property interest, right, harmed or taken away here? Two red flags, right? One, somebody gets fired from a job, right, for the government. And two, the government does something to harm somebody's reputation. So number one, you need to know the Roth case, R-O-T-H, right, from your reading. That's the case where a non-tenured professor at a state university, right, if this was a private university, there'd be no due process issue. A state university doesn't really fire, just doesn't renew the contract, right, of a professor who did not have tenure. The professor did not have tenure and did not have a multi-year contract. The professor had a one-year contract that expired, and the university said once the contract expired, we're not renewing it. The professor then sued, right, claiming a due process violation, claiming that he was entitled to some kind of a hearing, right, to make his case that he should be retained. Now, you're not going to get, right, due process, again, unless number one, you got a state actor, which we have here, and number two, you have a deprivation of a liberty or a property interest. Now, certainly the professor wasn't arrested or detained, right, or anything like that. Freedom of movement was not restricted. So there was no liberty interest at stake. So the question was, did the professor have, right, life, liberty, or property, a property interest in, as the court put it, in continued employment, right, with the state university? Here's the rule. It's a pretty simple one. If you are an at-will employee, right, with no expectation, these are the magic words, no reasonable expectation of continued employment, right? So you don't have tenure, you don't have a long-term contract, right? If that's the case, then you have no reasonable expectation of continued employment with the state. And if you have no reasonable expectation, right, you're not entitled to it. You're not entitled to it. You shouldn't expect it. If you do expect it, your expectation is not reasonable because you're at will and you have no, right, and the state is under no contractual obligation to continue to employ you. So, if you have no tenure and no long-term contract and you're an at-will employee, right, and your employment expires, the holding, right, of Roth was that then you have no reasonable expectation of continued employment and you have no property interest in continuing, right, your employment with the state. Okay, so I'll review that later, but that's the rule. Now, again, so I make sure I can cover both here in this video. The second, harm to reputation, Paul versus Davis. Know that case, right? That's the case where the government distributed leaflets around accusing somebody of being a shoplifter. And again, I think this is a really interesting question, right? The government did that without providing, the person whose reputation was harmed. Obviously, so this went around to, right, hundreds of people saw this flyer, right, which had a picture of the person on it and his name and accused him of being a shoplifter, but he had never been convicted of being a shoplifter. You know, that might strike you as not right, as not fair, right? The government destroying this person's reputation, right, without giving him any procedural protections before doing that. Nonetheless, the court says, harm to reputation standing alone, is not a liberty or property interest, right, that triggers due process protections. You have to show more than that the government just harmed your reputation, right, to trigger due process. There might be other causes of action, but there's not a due process cause of action. Because again, due process is only triggered by a deprivation of life, liberty, or property. It has to fit into one of those categories, and your reputation doesn't neatly fit into one of those. So, how do you know you're being tested on, right, or challenged, right, on whether there is a property or a liberty interest at stake? Again, life is pretty obvious. Look for those two fact patterns. If you see public employment, check for tenure or a long-term contract. If you don't see one, there is no reasonable expectation of continued employment and no property interest. Check harm to reputation, right, when the claim is the government, right, dragged my name through the mud without giving me due process. That alone is not going to trigger due process because there is no liberty or property interest in your good name. Okay, in the next video we'll talk about then what? If you are entitled to due process, right, what does that mean?